Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 21st episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I am grateful that you are here. Last time, we shifted our focus to ancient China. We traced the origins of Chinese civilization, marveled at their technological and philosophical advances, and followed some of the major dynasties, from the earliest prehistory through the unification of China under the Qin. I also tripped over myself, qualifying that for something as complex and majestic as Chinese history, much greater detail was available to those so inclined to explore this history on their own. As with the treatment of Indian history, I wanted to give an overview of the high-level outline, but I also acknowledge that this is complicated. I know that these stories and histories mean a lot to a lot of people, and I've tried to write this in such a way so as not to get too deep into the details while still being respectful of quite literally billions and billions of people. I hope I've succeeded, and I appreciate you being on this journey with me. We covered a lot of ground in our last episode, and we got all the way from the beginning of history to within a few decades of Wu the Great. He's our main focus for today. After all, he is Wu the Great, so we will close the remaining gap as quickly as we can. The Qin were firmly committed to the principles of legalism, the philosophy that man was intrinsically bad and strict obedience to the law and severe consequences for breaking it were the only way to have a strong state. They had no use for the Confucian ideal of benevolent kingship. The Qin dynasty was an autocracy from the outset, and this was completely personified by the founder of the dynasty and the first ruler of united China, Qin Shi Huang. Qin Shi Huang is a monumental figure, and if his successors had hung on to power long enough to write the histories of the period, he might have been called the Great. After all, he was the first person to unite all of China, and people have been laying claim to the title of the Great for a lot less. As it turns out, his successors lost their grip on power pretty quickly, and thus, likewise, they lost the ability to control the narrative. Besides, it's not like they were big on scholarly pursuits. As a result of all of this, history remembers him as something far worse. He is worth spending a few minutes to get to know. Not content with simply being king, Qin Shi Huang styled himself as emperor, a title that Chinese rulers would adopt for the next 2,000 years. His rule was an exercise in pure power, and he made sure that everyone knew that he was the head dude in charge. The military conquests of the Qin that led to the political consolidation of China did more than simply redraw lines on a map. Qin Shi Huang undertook a dramatic and sweeping program of standardization. He unified currency, laws, weights, measures, administration, and the military. He integrated the different kingdoms into a single polity with a single set of rules and norms, and he oversaw the development of a road system to tie it all together. As we saw in the Darius episodes, building and maintaining an imperial road system can have massive economic benefits, as well as give a ruler an efficient way to move troops back and forth across an empire to confront would-be rebels or defend borders from barbarian incursions. Perhaps the most important step in this program of standardization was the written language. You will recall from the previous episode that Chinese civilization co-evolved in several different regions. The Chinese script was likewise regionally varied. Qin Shi Huang applied his efficient and ruthless administrative genius to this challenge. The Qin took great pains to unify the script into a cogent national standard. These reforms significantly centralized control and unlocked trade and commerce. Qin Shi Huang also undertook a program aimed at formalizing and professionalizing the state bureaucracy. He divided the government administration into three: a civil administration, a military authority, and a censorate. This third group was composed of inspectors who evaluated the ability and efficiency of officials throughout the bureaucracy. These were not positions passed down as part of a family legacy. Rather, in theory at least, administrative positions went to people of merit, who were appointed and dismissed by the emperor. This structure operated at three levels: the central government, and provincial, and then local administrations. Qin Shi Huang built an elegant administrative structure and stocked it from top to bottom with capable people. In part to undermine the power of local aristocrats, Qin Shi Huang deconstructed some of the feudal aspects of Chinese society, breaking apart estates of the landed gentry and distributing their land to peasants, who were then to be taxed directly by the state. So far so good, right? Qin Shi Huang's motivations for undermining the landed nobility were not altruistic. His aim was to eliminate rivals, to take their power away, especially nobles from other princely families, to boost his own revenues at the same time. In order to make sure his marginalized rivals could not reestablish a power base, he ordered the noble families to send members to live in the capital, where they could be monitored closely and punished should their families act up. He essentially took hostages, used the terror of relatives as a tool for social control, and instituted a state spy program to ensure that there were no threats to his power. And all the tax revenue he began to gather up, he poured it all back into his military. South of the Qin Empire lay closely related people called the Yue. Occupying what is now southern China and northern Vietnam, the Yue had stayed out of the roiling conflict of the warring states period. Skilled artisans and savvy merchants, the Yue were linked into highly profitable trade networks that connected them to numerous countries. The Yue's land was also highly agriculturally productive. They were well-fed, wealthy, and maddeningly to Qin Shi Huang, independent. He set his army loose, determined to conquer the Yue and appropriate their trade networks and territory. The army marched south, but it was up against a different kind of terrain than any in which they had fought before, including tropical forests and jungles. For their part, the Yue were determined to resist Qin incursion into their turf. The first foray into Yue territory for Qin's army was a catastrophe, and 10,000 of his best troops were wiped out. This did not abate Qin Shi Huang's resolve. If his troops were going to struggle to manage logistics fighting in unfamiliar territory, then he would seek to even the scales. Drawing from his nearly unlimited supply of labor, he ordered people to put down weapons, pick up shovels, and start digging. Leveraging the numerous waterways that crisscross here and there, Qin Shi Huang's conscripts dug a canal into and through Yue territory. This let him move his armies and supplies with ease, keeping his troops well supplied and giving them mobility to strike when and where they chose. It took a few years, but Qin Shi Huang was relentless, and in his series of campaigns, he crushed Yue resistance and appropriated their land in lucrative trade networks, and pushed his borders all the way to the modern border of Vietnam. With this territory incorporated into the fringes of his empire, Qin Shi Huang set about enforcing the same standards of currency, language, weights, measures, and so on into Yue territory. In order to accelerate this forced assimilation, he gathered up 500,000 people from his northern territories and forced them to move south to colonize his new holdings. In previous episodes, we've explored how conquerors like the Assyrians, Egyptians, and Babylonians took captives and forcibly resettled them. This is the first time a ruler had taken his own people and moved them en masse. No one was given a choice. At a blink, 500,000 people had to move to an unfamiliar land with an unfamiliar climate and make new lives for themselves, all in pursuit of their ruler's territorial ambitions. Qin Shi Huang was not only preoccupied with his southern border. To the north, the kingdoms of the Zhou and Warring States periods had had to contend with nomadic barbarians raiding into their territory. Each of these states had responded by building defensive walls to help fend off the roving hordes. With China, and I think from here on out we can refer to the polity as China as it's now an integrated entity, the kingdom needed a major upgrade in its defensive fortifications. Qin Shi Huang had no qualms about commanding massive amounts of people to undertake his pet projects, and the idea of a single wall to protect his empire was no exception. His vision for this wall was exceedingly ambitious and would require labor, lots and lots of labor. On his command, his administrators conscripted 300,000 people to leave their homes behind and join the project for a state-mandated construction project. The laborers, force-marched from their homes to the local job sites, toiled in brutal conditions, supervised by merciless taskmasters. The result was the establishment, the building, the construction of the first Great Wall of China, a monumental undertaking that has become synonymous with the country itself. Of course, the images that come to mind when we think of the Great Wall date to a much later period, but the idea for the wall and the callous indifference to the suffering of those who built it started in the visionary and ruthless mind of Qin Shi Huang. The ideas of unification and standardization were indeed central to Qin Shi Huang's rule. His empire was an extension of his will. Firmly entrenched in the legalist way of ruling, his tolerance for dissent was exactly zero. Remember, legalism itself was one of the countless philosophies of the 100 schools of thought. This meant that there were a lot of competing intellectual traditions and alternative ideas, most notably Confucianism. Qin Shi Huang didn't just disagree with these other ideas, he wanted to stamp them out. In the world's first recorded book burning, Qin Shi Huang ordered all texts, treatises, and histories that could undermine his autocratic rule to be gathered up and set ablaze. Not everything was destroyed, only that which could be seen as detrimental to Qin dynasty. But given how increasingly paranoid and megalomaniacal Qin Shi Huang got as his rule progressed, a lot was deemed to be contrary to his version of orthodoxy. So much knowledge, so much wisdom, so much documentation of the country's rich history, gone, burned in the flames. But for Qin Shi Huang, it wasn't enough to obliterate the written word. Even possessing contrary ideas was more than he could tolerate. The most dangerous ideas to Qin Shi Huang were those of the Confucians. As such, to be a Confucian scholar was a very dangerous thing indeed. Confucianism was completely repressed. To drive home the point, Qin Shi Huang condemned 460 Confucian scholars to be rounded up and buried alive. Scholars understand the burning of the books to be a historical event. The burying of the scholars is more controversial. Some seem to suggest that this really happened. Others claim that this was later propaganda, slander by the successors of the Qin used to highlight the horrors of a prior dynasty. Personally, it seems perfectly in keeping with the nature of Qin Shi Huang that he would do such a thing, but the truth may never be known. There was a lot more to the rule of Qin Shi Huang than what I've described so far. As mentioned, he is one of the towering figures of Chinese history. Not the least reason being that without him, who knows what we'd even mean when we said China. My goal at the outset of this episode was to give a brief summary of the origins and development of Chinese civilization to set the stage for Wu the Great. In terms of timelines, he's not far off. We are pretty close. And this isn't a history of Qin Shi Huang, so we're going to conclude the prologue part of the Wu the Great episode by admitting that we skipped some details, but hoping this overview was interesting and useful, and by killing Qin Shi Huang because, in death, he might have been an even larger character than he was in life, and also because his obsessions with immortality played a role in the downfall of his dynasty. Before he led the Qin state to victory in the Warring States period, before he rose to become the most important figure in ancient China, Qin Shi Huang had a sense of his destiny, of his greatness. In 246 BCE, upon ascending to the throne of the Qin, he ordered the construction of an elaborate mausoleum. Over the nearly 4 decades of its construction, the emperor's mausoleum would grow to become an entire city. It was modeled on Xiangyang, the capital of the Qin, which was laid out with an inner circle and an outer circle. At its largest extent, the outer circle of the mausoleum, truly a city of the dead, covered nearly 4 square miles. At its center, it was capped by an earthen mound nearly 250 feet tall. There is believed to be an entire subterranean palace complex for the emperor, complete with rivers of mercury to simulate the sacred waterways so essential to the power of a Chinese ruler. Decade after decade, artisans worked and toiled away at the monumental project. Later in his rule, his combination of megalomania and paranoia led to lots of executions, assassination attempts, purges, and all the horrid stuff that comes along with such tragedies. Qin Shi Huang took up residence in his city of the dead upon his own death in 210 BCE, though some finishing touches still needed completing, and that meant work continued for a couple years after his death. In the end, he died undramatically. While he was away from his capital directing this project and that campaign, he was 49 years old, and he had led the Qin to great heights and then himself even further. As hinted a moment ago, his obsession with his own glory and prestige would have severe consequences for his successors. While his mausoleum had been under construction for nearly 4 decades, he couldn't just roll into his new digs. He died far from home, while touring his eastern territories. His retainers, ever aware of the tendency for malcontents to revolt with changes of leadership, decided the best thing they could do to ease the transition to his successor was to get the dead emperor's body and the rest of his imperial household back to the capital before anyone knew he'd even died. They wanted to keep everything all weekend at Bernie's, and that led on that the fearsome Qin Shi Huang was dead until they had a firm plan for succession in place. As they marched back towards the capital, his staff made a big show of coming and going from his quarters, carrying messages, changes of clothes, food, etc. When the body began to smell, they ordered 10 carts of dead fish to be pushed in front of the convoy, masking the scent and keeping their secret. He'd packed a lot of life into his 5 decades, and it was time for some rest. Before we give him his final say, let's take a closer look at the mausoleum itself, and the events both before and after he took up residency as ruler of his city of the dead. The centerpiece of the mausoleum, and another of the famous works that go hand in glove with our image of ancient China, was the army conscripted to protect Qin Shi Huang in the afterlife. Today known as the Terracotta Army, Qin Shi Huang was interred with thousands of life-size terracotta soldiers, complete with their full complement of weapons, who had been standing vigil over the tomb of the emperor for thousands of years. Each terracotta soldier, all 8,000 of them, is unique, likely created in the image of a real-life soldier in Qin Shi Huang's army, To make each terracotta warrior truly lifelike, they were each painted from head to toe in precise and vibrant polychrome. In addition to the foot soldiers, there were hundreds of horses, also life-sized, unique, and painted, and a complement of real, i.e. not terracotta, carts, battle chariots, and all sorts of military objects. To make sure the emperor had enjoyment, not just protection in the afterlife, there were terracotta jesters and musicians to see to his amusement. The scope and scale of his mausoleum, his city of the dead with himself at its center, is utterly staggering. Some records suggest that at one point as many as 700,000 forced laborers were conscripted for its construction. It's unfathomably huge, and the amount of skilled artisans needed to carve an entire, true-to-life terracotta army is hard to fathom. And all of this was lost until 1974, when two locals digging a well accidentally broke through into the tomb and started gathering up artifacts for sale. Only a fraction has been excavated. The emperor's tomb, the inner sanctum of his mausoleum, has not been opened. He's probably still in there. The death of Qin Shi Huang, the unifier of China and the founder of the Qin dynasty, did not end his impact on the course of Chinese history. Qin Shi Huang had plenty of sons that could succeed him. The crown prince, his son Fu Su, was learned, wise, and just. He was more genteel, kind, and refined than his father. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the two did not get along terribly well, as Qin Shi Huang saw these traits as weaknesses. When his father died, Fu Su was poised to take over with the sage counsel of the general Meng Tian to help guide the way. A conspiracy of courtly retainers, eager to exercise power, wished to place a pliant king on the throne, one more likely to let them do as they wish while he pursued his petty vices. They found a willing partner in one of the dead emperor's young sons, Hu Hai. Together, they forged a letter from Qin Shi Huang ordering Fu Su and Meng Tian to commit suicide. Meng Tian knew it was a farce and begged Fu Su to ignore it and take control, but he declined. Driven by a sense of duty, even knowing that the letter was a forgery, he duly complied and committed suicide. Meng Tian reluctantly followed suit and poisoned himself. The stage was set for the decidedly less upstanding Hu Hai to rule, surrounded by his devious co-conspirators. He immediately set about slaughtering his relatives and close advisors, so as to prevent any potential rivals to power. He also indulged in all the vices and debauchery that you might suspect he would, given the way he came to power. He ratcheted up the taxes on the poor and ordered masses of conscripts to begin building his own mausoleum complex, one to rival that of his father. Getting the throne was one thing, keeping it was another. Perhaps Fu Su had a chance to deal with some of the festering issues. The Qin could have stayed in power, but Qin Shi Huang had been a brutal and repressive leader. One contemporary historian said of the late emperor, quote, "He killed men as though he could never finish. He punished men as though he were afraid he would never get around to them all, and the whole world revolted against him." Close quote. The death of China's first emperor and the tyranny of his vile son led to a furious and sweeping rebellion. People rose up all over, anxious to throw off the Qin yoke. You may recall that the massive mausoleum of the first emperor was not quite complete by the time he died. One of the low-level Qin enforcers was tasked with bringing a group of prisoners to the mausoleum for some good old-fashioned forced Qin labor. With rebellion surging across China, perhaps this guy was a bit lax. A group of his conscripts escaped. Under Qin law, the transgression of letting forced laborers flee their post was punishable by death for the careless supervisor. Faced with the prospect of such punishment, the escort, a humble man from peasant origin named Liu Bang, freed the rest of the prisoners, then fled himself and joined in the spate of rebellions. Back in the palace, things went bad to worse for the teetering Qin dynasty. In 206 BCE, one of Hu Hai's co-conspirators from the murder of Fu Su tried to take a run at being emperor himself, and he gathered up a horde of soldiers, rushed on Hu Hai, and forced the emperor to slit his own throat. When he died, so too did the short-lived Qin dynasty. With the emperor dead, other members of the royal family rushed to claim the throne. Eventually, the third and what would prove to be final Qin emperor was crowned. Zi Ying was fated to quote-unquote rule for about a month and a half. He would prove to be so insignificant that no one today even knows who he was, what his claim to the throne was, etc. Meanwhile, revolts against the Qin spread across China. No clear successor emerged, and the claimants were all too focused on killing off rivals than doing anything to stabilize the rapidly deteriorating situation. China devolved into bloody chaos. A bloodthirsty power grab for control of the empire seized the palace, but the empire itself was convulsed with anti-Qin rebellions. These flaring rebellions are often described as the first peasant revolt in Chinese history. There's a lot of mythologizing centered on this period, but it seems that the first groups that rose up were unarmed. The people were so committed to fighting for their freedom that they charged against the Qin armies with no weapons, counting on their huge numbers to overwhelm their foes. The rebellion pulsed with energy, but it was raw, primal, and unfocused. It needed leadership. Eventually, two upstart leaders vied to organize and focus the rebellion. One was a young noble with strong aristocratic credentials named Xiang Yu. The other was a peasant, likely illiterate, but cunning and charismatic, named Liu Bang. He is the same guy we met earlier who freed the labor conscripts under his supervision, rather than force them to work on the dead emperor's tomb. So grateful were these laborers that they joined Liu's side and became some of his earliest soldiers and fervent supporters. At first, the two worked well together, organizing and focusing the raw energy of the peasant revolt, planning strategy and winning battles. As they overthrew the Qin city by city, province by province, the revolutionaries took care to undo the onerous and autocratic policies of the Qin. Things went well, when they were united by a common enemy, that was. But when it became clear that the Qin were broken, each partner realized that one of them would become emperor and the other would be left without power. The question of who would be emperor turned the rebellion in on itself. Xiang Yu was the stronger partner. With their breach not fully out in the open, Xiang Yu plotted against Liu Bang. He made his move by organizing a great banquet and ordered that during a moment of dancing and revelry, an assassin should pounce on Liu Bang and cut him down. Tipped off in advance about this dire threat, Liu Bang made a show of needing to use the restroom, then snuck away into the night and to safety. With Liu Bang having fled the center of power, Xiang Yu had the leg up for control. He declared that the Qin Empire was dissolved and reorganized the territory into 18 different kingdoms, appointing various rulers, administrators, and magistrates. Liu Bang was granted rule over one of these territories and made king of the Han and sent to the outskirts. He feigned loyalty, but by being so far away, Liu Bang could plan his own power play. He fully broke with his former partner and focused his efforts on winning control of the Chinese empire for himself. The showdown between Liu Bang and Xiang Yu came in a period called the Shu-Han contention. It was a multi-sided civil war. It's a bit too complex to summarize succinctly, but needless to say, in 202 BCE, after a long-running drama with lots of twists and turns, Liu Bang emerged victorious, vanquishing Xiang Yu, defeating his army, and claiming the imperial throne for himself. He founded a new dynasty, one destined to succeed where the Qin had failed. This dynasty, the Han, would lead China to its greatest ancient heights. Before finally and firmly closing the final chapter on the Qin, it must be said that the unification of China into a centralized political entity was a significant accomplishment. The conquest of Qin Shi Huang transformed all the petty kingdoms and related but separate cultures into an integrated culture governed by a strong central state. As we will see shortly, the Han, the successors to the Qin, would take a very different approach to government, which would lead later historians to view them more favorably than their autocratic predecessors. However, the Han were only able to accomplish much of what they did because of the foundational work done by the Qin. The Han could afford a more humane administration because the Qin were so ruthless. Just like Xiangyang, the advisor that helped modernize and reform the Qin state only to be executed for his troubles, the ideas and methods established by the Qin would outlast them. It's a bit of a paradox, one we get to gleefully explore further. As emperor and founder of the Han dynasty, Liu Bang took a completely different approach than his predecessor. Playing to his humble origins, he insisted on simple court etiquette, lowered the taxes on farmers, fostered commerce, disbanded armies, reduced military and labor conscription, and strived to promote peace. In this last goal, he had mixed results, as he spent a large portion of his rule in the outskirts of the empire, tamping down rebellions at the margins. Perhaps one of the ways that Liu Bang stands out in history is that he's one of the very few people that seem to have improved themselves upon gaining unfettered power. In his rebellion phase, Liu Bang had scorned philosophical thinking, even considering reading itself as a waste of time. But upon his seizure of the throne, and with wise retainers around him, Liu Bang worked on expanding his mind and thinking hard about the role of a ruler. He began to drift towards Confucianism, and he invited Confucian scholars to join his court and help advise the state. This would have a big impact on his successors. Liu Bang suffered an arrow wound on campaign, and his health deteriorated as a result. He died in 195 BCE after a rule of about 7 years. He had accomplished a lot, but perhaps his greatest legacy was the establishment of the Han Dynasty, which would lead China to its golden age. The Han period would last 4 centuries. My description of it as a Chinese golden age paints a picture of smooth sailing and enlightened leadership over a prolonged period of time. Things were good for China in general, but the inner workings of the Han court were a nightmare of intrigue, betrayals, and power plays, and each emperor had his own challenges to deal with. Roughly 50 years after the death of Liu Bang, the 6th ruler of the Han Dynasty, Emperor Jing, was on the throne. He had a lot to balance. His rule got off to an auspicious start. On the day he took the throne, a son named Li Que was born to him, his 11th, but almost immediately he faced a major revolt in what's known as the Rebellion of the Seven States. This arose when the semi-independent fiefdoms within the empire resisted Han attempts at further consolidation and centralization. Emperor Jing crushed this rebellion, which only served to further Han control and erode what little autonomy princelings had over their territory. This was a straightforward challenge. Rebels rise up, take out the army, smack them around, dust off your hands, job well done. Far more complex for the emperor to navigate were all the palace intrigues and the rivalries between retainers, queens, and consorts, especially over the matter of succession. When I say this is complicated, I mean it's really complicated. So much so that you're going to have to be okay with an absurd oversimplification. Emperor Jing, as so many rulers of the time did, had lots of children with many women. His formal wife was childless. This set off a contest between consorts over whose son could succeed the throne. Liu Que was an unlikely contender. Not only was he the 11th son of Emperor Jing, but also his mother was outranked by a far more powerful lady at court. This woman, Lady Li, was delighted when her son was named crown prince, but this made her arrogant and insufferable. In time, Emperor Jing grew frustrated, then completely fed up. He deposed Lady Li from her rank, stripped his chosen successor of any claim to the throne, and elevated one of his younger sons from another woman to be crown prince. This is how, when Emperor Jing died in 141 BCE, Liu Que became the 7th ruler of the Han Dynasty. In the first part of this episode, I talked about naming conventions and how complicated they can be. This is all the more true for people who assume different regnal names, as there's a kind of before and after. If it's okay with you, I'm going to simply refer to Liu Que from here on out as Emperor Wu of the Han, and dispense with all the other names by which he was referred. Emperor Wu ascended to the throne at age 15. His accession was due to more than just palace intrigue. From his earliest days, his father had recognized the boy's natural talents. He was bright and energetic, clearly a talented young man. Despite his spot in the birth order, Wu stood out as an unusually bright and capable young man. In time, it was this natural talent that had led his father to appoint him as crown prince and successor. On the throne, Wu demonstrated the wisdom of his father's selection. Wu applied tremendous energy from the outset of his rule. Aided by the counsel of his mother and other court retainers, Wu pursued several important reforms to improve the Han administration and the lives of its subjects. But his ability to implement his desired reforms was fraught with challenges. Early in his reign, his attempts at reform were thwarted by petty court intrigues, including having several key initiatives subverted by his grandmother, who was acting as regent given his tender age. His grandmother, the Grand Dowager Empress Dao, was deeply conservative, and she believed that Wu's intended reforms would bring about the collapse of the Han. She held great sway at court, and many of the inner circle of the administration owed their loyalties to her, not their new teenage emperor. Wu could not simply order people around, and he faced a stern test right at the outset. His solution to this dilemma was cunning and revealed a far-sightedness. He recruited a group of young officials from among the commoners and appointed them to minor, inconsequential roles in his administration. This cohort was thus not part of the nobility, and instead deeply loyal to Wu. Their official roles were so minor that no one paid them any mind, but their mission was to serve as the eyes and ears of the emperor, and they filled this role with great effectiveness. Given their low level and peasant births, the haughty nobles at court paid these retainers no mind, and they moved throughout the palace without anyone paying them much mind. They saw, they listened, and they reported everything back to the emperor. With their help, Wu was able to navigate the intrigues of the court and stay a step ahead of his adversaries. In time, these intrigues would subside for two reasons. The first is that as he aged, he learned to assert himself as emperor and to ignore the pestering or meddling interventions of people. The second is that some of the older conservative anti-reformists simply died off in time, as did the Grand Empress Dowager Du in 135 BCE. She had served as the leader of the conservative faction, and when she died, that group was suddenly devoid of patronage. Wu dismissed them all and replaced them with his cohort of loyal retainers. In one fell swoop, he installed a deeply loyal group of advisors who shared his vision for reform. With that in mind, then, let's explore some of these great reforms. One of his first and most important reforms was to shift the philosophical underpinning of the entire regime. The Qin had adopted the cynical brutality of legalism, and their dynasty did not survive past one generation after its founding. The Han rejected the harsh and punitive legalist system, and, at first, moved towards Taoism as the guiding force behind their administration. This presented its own set of challenges, however, for while Taoism was much milder, it also led a very hands-off approach in the provinces and with the nobility. These regions grew haughty and resisted efforts to check the growing power of the Han authority. The genteel nature of Taoism made it harder for the Han to suppress rebellions and assert its authority on the periphery of the empire. And when push came to shove, the power of the state needed to come first. It was Wu's father who had to suppress the rebellion of the Seven States. So Taoism, it turned out, was not the best mindset for running a major empire, and legalism was likewise demonstrably ineffective. It was early in Wu's tenure that he pivoted the empire towards the more benevolent Confucian model of government. You may remember that Confucianism had emerged from the period of intellectual flowering called the Hundred Schools of Thought period, an intellectual renaissance that had, paradoxically, accompanied great warfare and political chaos. The Qin had chosen legalism as the philosophical basis of their role and suppressed any contrary ideas through book burnings and possibly the executions of non-legalist scholars. Gripped by a sense of loss over this forgotten knowledge, Wu nevertheless tried to reclaim as many of the great ideas that could still be found. On his orders, his retainers gathered up as many of the surviving ideas from the Hundred Schools of Thought period. Informed by these great concepts, his court advisors tried to synthesize them into something akin to a state philosophy, a guided set of principles that would permeate and guide their approach to rule. But legalism was not without its uses. The framework developed by the Qin, including the tiered structure to government, the various supervisory committees, the inspection and regulation of the administrators themselves, were all fundamentally solid. What the Han did was overlay a more philosophically Confucian approach to the care for and protection of their subjects on top of the legalist governance institutions developed by the Qin. Wu thus created a system known as state Confucianism. Not only was it fundamentally fair and more just, but his more humane approach to governments laid a more sustainable foundation for the dynasty. State Confucianism was ultimately grounded in pragmatism. It grafted the Confucian belief in the fundamental goodness of mankind onto the governing apparatus built under the more cynical legalist belief in man's inherent wickedness. By treating the subjects fairly, the Han removed the incentive for rebellion. Shifting the Confucian ideals into the apparatus of state was a big factor why the Han dynasty lasted nearly 450 years. This wasn't a purely altruistic move. To be sure, a big reason for the shift to Confucianism was to undermine the power of local nobility and the landed gentry. Wu understood that a strong and semi-independent territory could undermine state control, and he took great pains to normalize and consolidate rule into his central government. To that end, he deconstructed many of the tolls and inspection stations that local elites had installed as a means of controlling local populations and travelers. This eased the difficulty of traveling throughout the empire and enabled better commerce and communication. Removing tolls is always a popular move with the local population, and this simple step took away a common cause of disaffection toward the ruling elite and increased the popularity of the emperor. Keeping an eye on the well-being of the population of the provinces was a priority for Wu. One of the expectations of holding local office in the Han Empire was that administrators needed to keep an eye out for people of talent and make recommendations for candidates for public service. This was quite a novel innovation, government officials scouting for talent in order to bring in capable people to improve the quality of governance. But they went further. In 165 BCE, the Han instituted the world's first civil service examination to test the capabilities of candidates for administrative roles and gauge their ability to serve the state and thus the people. They followed this by founding a Confucian training academy, where government officials were taught the canonical Confucian texts so that trainees could learn how to be effective administrators in line with the ideals of Confucian governance and ethics. By the end of the first century of its existence, more than 30,000 students had passed through this training academy, populating the imperial administration with people of both intrinsic talent and education. This method of examination and training was maintained for the better part of the next 2,000 years. It's hard to overstate how revolutionary this was. Certainly, there had been periods of time when merit mattered in candidacy for any official government role, but never had any polity systematically and proactively sought out the very best people from its kingdom, screened them for actual ability, and then trained them thoroughly in the arts and ethics of fair-minded statecraft. This was a huge leap forward in civil service and administration. Some of the challenges with which Wu had to contend long predated his rule. One of these was the stubborn independence of the kingdom to his south. While Qin Shi Huang had attacked and subdued several Yue kingdoms in South China, his death opened the door for local rulers to seek to seize back control and reassert their own kingdoms. The rulers of Minyue, one of these kingdoms, had even assisted Liu Bang in his overthrow of the Qin. They, along with Nanyue, another Yue kingdom, had enjoyed independence from the Han in the early years of the dynasty. In fact, those kingdoms were more concerned with fighting each other than they were worried about the Han. But this changed early in Wu's reign. 3 years into his rule, in 138 BCE, Minyue invaded another of the lesser kingdoms, Oyue. This kingdom had likewise assisted Liu Bang in his anti-Qin rebellion, and they had been rewarded with local rule and great favor from the Han. When Minyue invaded, the Oyue appealed to Wu. Ignoring the carping of his nagging grandmother, who was still alive at this point and pushing her conservative agenda, Wu intervened. The young king drove out and chastened the Minyue and restored the balance of power in the region. This gave him much-needed credibility early in his rule. Of note, in conducting this campaign, this marked the first time Wu had demonstrated a streak of independence and openly defied his grandmother. The southern kingdoms again fell into chaos when Minyue invaded Nanyue in 135 BCE. Again, Wu intervened, this time partitioning Minyue and directly administering half the territory under Han control. The other half of Minyue was given over to a puppet king who ruled in his name but as an extension of the will of the Han. The southern kingdoms would again flare up as a sore spot in 111 BCE, but for now, Wu has some other looming challenges to deal with, which is a great place to pause for the story today. Once again, we've covered a lot of ground. We established and toppled China's first dynasty, we met the Han, the brilliant and much more humane successors to the Qin, and we put Wu on the throne and let him get started on what would eventually become a magnificent career. With that in mind, thank you for listening to this episode. I am grateful that you did. Join us on the next one when we conclude our series of Wu of the Han, Han Wudi, or Wu, call him what you will. Just be sure to call him the Great.